The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting group. Access Fort Wayne is a department of the Allen County Public Library. If you or anyone you know might be interested in making a television show, please call 260-421-1250.
Hi, Dr. Rudy Cashman. Welcome to my Mind, Body, Spirit show. Today's show is very interesting, and it's based on a lot of information which I've read in other books over the years, but today I will be quoting a great deal out of this book here. You can get in the library, you can order it online, How Sugar Corrupted the World. How sugar corrupted the world. How interesting is that? When especially sugar is really the main problem. That's what's causing this illness we have. It isn't fat. 50 years they told us it was the fat. That was industry at work and the government and promoting incorrect information. It was sugar all along. And now I think the majority of people are well aware of it. So let's talk about sugar in our time and sugar in the past. So how did it come to us that billions need sugar every day? All over the world now, people, a lot of addicted to sugar. Let's just face it. And that's resulting in all these chronic illnesses. We're looking at about 30 of them. And the weight problems that people have, there's a judgment-free zone, okay? Who hasn't had a weight problem one time or another? So let's go back in history a little bit. I mean, why, for example, is Coca-Cola at this time selling zero sugar drinks? Because the science has caught up with them. They are now demonstrating that it causes many diseases, diabetes, and the 30, 50 diseases it causes. So let's go on the road. Sugar has pariah status now. The majority of us realize it's really not good. It's really not good. So let's go back in history a little bit. In the 1600s, a long time ago, sugar was very costly, very expensive. Only the real rich people could afford it. The kings and queens, they had it. And if you see pictures of them, for example, you will see a lot of them have blackened teeth or no teeth or missing tooth. Here and there, it's in their paintings and pictures. If you look at them carefully, average person was consuming 3 or 5 pounds of sugar. Now it's about 200 pounds, and some people more than that. Okay, it was just very expensive, and after that, it got a little bit cheaper. So by the 1800s or so, begin the 1800s, that it was getting cheaper, and the prices going up and down, by 1800s, though, the poorest were able to consume it, and even then, it was a threat to their health. A lot of them became overweight, became diabetic, which has 30 to 50 diseases attached to it. Look at my other YouTube shows, you'll see more about that. Eventually, it spread throughout the world, staggering numbers. Went to China, to India, Asia, the U.S., and Australia eventually. Now is consuming about 50 kilos per person per year, about 100 to 150 pounds, which we are almost, many people are 200 and some I'm sure more than that. And And now it's been placed in fast food. So processed food, a lot of these fast food restaurants, which are spread all over the world now. China, India have these now. And the food has been sweetened. You're not adding sugar to it. It's already in the food. About 40% of sugar that people are taking every day has been added by the processing food companies, which makes fast food not too good for you. Okay? But we'll discuss that more. And now it's being cultivated, grown all over the world. Originally, it was only certain countries, but now there's sweetness in food and drink, and like I said, the colonies are all over the world. But let's go through the early history. A lot of the sugary plants really came from Asia, and they spread to India, and then they spread to China, and then it was eventually transported to the Mediterranean countries. Italy was a big country, and then eventually across the Atlantic to America by ships and slaves. It was very expensive and costly to cultivate it. It was really hard work. That if you didn't have to pay for the workers, then it could be sold at an affordable price. That's why slavery came along, and they enslaved Africans, but also people from other countries, also. Then it was grown at first off a lot of the islands off the coast of Africa, like the Canary Islands, Madeira, which is closer to Europe, but it's a good distance of northeast Africa. It was grown a lot there, and then the Canary Islands, and slaves were transported there, and then it was sold in Britain and in Europe. But there were problems with the labor everywhere. That's the reason slavery got involved. Slaves and indentured workers, they had they owed you some money. They would work for a year or 2 or 5 years at a very low wage, paid them a little bit. They were not quite treated like slaves, but the people who owned the farm generally were not that nice to them, okay? And a lot of the sugar plantation had on them alien people. They were from India, from China, from Africa. They were black slaves, but there were white slaves too. So it was really a slavery environment, okay? And to do these colonies and these farms, they had to destroy the environment. Yeah, a lot of the islands they went to eventually in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, they deforested them. They took all the trees and forests off to turn them into farm. They really destroyed the environment and destroyed the people too. I mean, when Columbus came here in late 1400s, he saw the most beautiful slaves on the islands around us in the Caribbean. Beautiful people, okay? But his soldiers his people on his boat were carrying viruses, and viruses totally decimated the native people. Essentially, all the natives living on these islands around Africa, around the Canary Islands, around the Caribbean, all the native people were essentially killed by the viruses. They had no immunity. And they were beautiful people because they were living off nature. They were not living off artificially created or processed foods. That's in multiple books, so this is for real. The Barbados and Florida, and it was a harsh business. people were beaten, they were killed. There were about 12 million slaves made it from Africa to the Caribbean. Maybe 11 million survived. Many died on the terrible conditions that were on these ships. But why do we like sugars so much? Sweet. Before that, people lived mainly off honey. Yeah, mainly off honey. When Columbus came to the Americas, honey was already here, but he bought beets, which were discovered in Germany. A man discovered an enzyme that means the beets could be converted to sugar. I lived in Germany as a child, and I remember we grew a lot of beets. And so bribery was involved, and these sugar was used to put into other foods, so they would seek them. Okay, even Shakespeare put it in his literature, but a certain amount of sugar makes you feel good, because we have in us dopamine and serotonin, which makes us feel good quickly, but a small amount. Nature even designed it that, say, maybe 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that we would seek plants because they have a little bit of sugar in them, and we could live, and we could store it, because food, you just couldn't go to a market or grocery store because it was seasonal. It only was grown in certain seasons. Incidentally, a person, say, of normal weight has in them actually quite a bit of fat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can be normal weight, and like myself, I've got in me 40,000 calories of fat. Yeah, but sugar, maybe 1 teaspoonful normally. 2,000 calories of glycogen, which is stored sugar. So you can, after a certain number of hours, you run out of sugar and you go into fat metabolism. Something I'm going to speak a little bit more about later. It's anything to know. And then then sugar spread through the Arabic countries, Persian countries, and it was even used a lot in the churches. It spread to the West during the Crusades, about year 1000 or so. The Crusades brought them back, and they ate them on the road as they were retreating from the Arab countries. They survived on sugar, on cane sugar, and that sort of carried it west. And also, when we look back in history, we find that there was cane sugar was already existing 26,000 years ago, because they found it in rock art. They saw it in caves, and honey was discovered at that time. So, in the classical literature of yesteryear, there are some images of honey. In Homer's Odyssey, it says in there, "Never has any man passed this way in his dark and unheard of that honey sweet music from his lips. It has taken his delight and then gone away in the winter." So in other words, they ate some sugar as they passed through different cities to make them feel good. The Odyssey, the Roman text, refers to honey also. And Roman doctors used it as medicine because medicine wasn't tasting very good, and they would add a little bit of sugar to make it taste good. The Bible has in it images of honey. So let me give you a quote from the Bible. When the Lord led the Israelis out of Egypt, there was a profusion of images of honey out of Egypt, and he led them to a land of milk and honey. Okay, so I'm just trying to tell you how far back history of sugar is. So honey offered a tribute to the gods. Egypt, Greece, and the Hindus, Islam also used sugar in their churches for religion. And I notice even now today, a lot of churches serve you donuts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But now that we know sugar's unhealthy, I would suggest it be something different. I'm trying to change the world. Okay, so honey was used by the Islamic nations a great deal as medicine, and so sweet food was valued by Islamic societies. The Prophet liked honey and recommended it as medicine. Mm-hmm. And probably it made people feel better. Might be better than the drug they were taking. And so cane sugar is what was largely used in the beginning, but then eventually, remember, they discovered that there was sugar in beets, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Honey had a special place in Islamic society. Honey remains in the portal in Islamic life. The Quran, I'll quote from there, "To enjoy sweet is a sign of faith. Honey is God's medicine." Yeah, interesting. So it is attached to all religions. And they speak about heaven in the future, and there would be rivers of honey in heaven. And whenever, generally, Islamic family eats, they have some sugary product at the end of the meal, kind of, maybe like most of us do, dessert. Yeah, okay, and so to this day, Islam uses sweet food quite a bit, but heck, so do we, all of us. 90% of us are using processed food and sugary desserts and sugary drinks. So it's not just one group of people. Okay. There's a cookbook that was published in the 8th or 9th century in Baghdad, and that had a few pages of sugary recipes in at that time. Sugar is the cane sugar is thought to originate somewhere in Asia. Okay, sugar entered. We're talking not about honey, but we're talking about cane sugar entered the Islamic world from probably India or China. By 1400, it was cultivated in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Africa, Spain, Ethiopia. So sugar was on the move, spreading across the world. But the raw plant, the sugary plant, they would boil it, for example, and make crystals out of it. But it was difficult work. But then they learned how to refine it with machinery. That really speeded things up. That made it more cheaper. Then it spread to many other countries. Okay, you read about it in the Arabian literature, the 1001 Nights, 9th century. There's a quote, and they're talking about the seeds is shaped like a pear, the crystals, but no head. Everyone loves it. We often chew on it after sunset during Ramadan. And so in 1492, there was a huge explosion of it in the Islamic world around the Mediterranean. sugar production was starting to develop. It was speeded up. And as I already mentioned, in the English encounter, the First Crusade, 1095, 1099, sugar spread from the Islamic world to the Christian world. The Earl of Derby was listed as candy. He called it candy. Now he was from the Crete, an island I visited once, played tennis on it actually. And also Edward I, 1287, brought 700 pounds of sugar. He mixed it with floury petals and sold it as medicine. The people used it as medicine. In the 1300s, English households started to have it. In the 16th century, it was widespread in England. Sugary products are widespread in England. It was just a matter of cost. And it was used as confectionery, sweet cakes, preserved. And they have found, actually, sugar can be used to preserve fruits. I remember as a child living in Germany, we had no refrigerators, but we had big barrels, and I remember it was filled full of fruits. And man, you know, the family would only allow you to partake of that here and there because they wanted to use it for a long time. It was a way of refrigeration, but I remember it tasted very sweet. I used to sneak in there now and then and grab a few tablespoonfuls, just enough that the family never figured out that I'd done that. And they started making sculptures out of sugar. You know, 1412, a mosque made out of sugar in Egypt around 1040. And elaborate sculptures were made, houses and personages and sculptures and statues, and all made out of sugar. You had a big celebration. Many times there were sugary statues there. And but in 1379, it was sold in grocery stores. We already mentioned there were lavish sculptures in Paris. Germans, Queen from Germany was visiting Paris, and part of the celebration they had that night was all type of sculptures made from sugar. They did notice in the French and the English courts, that's the area the kings and queens lived in, the court, okay? They all had dental problems. Yeah, teeth were falling out, they were black teeth, and people didn't realize there was sugar causing it. While I'm on the subject, I suggest, teach your kids how to take care of their teeth. Talk to the dentist or read about it or go online. But in my own experience, and I wasn't taught that till I hit college, believe it or not, but I brush my teeth twice a day and do some flossing. I've had very little trouble since. Take care of your teeth. A lot of diseases are spread out of there, including dementia and heart disease. Yes, because bacteria spend their time in your teeth. Just thought I'd bring that up while you're speaking about it. But in the 16th century, where they started using slaves as workers, sugar became cheaper. It spread throughout the world. And in 1635, it even went to the smallest of towns. It went everywhere. And the recipe books started coming out. And these housewives had books to follow of sugary foods. 1245, Montpelier, who was a pharmacist, to King Henry. He used a lot of sugary medicines, and King Henry III was missing his teeth because he was taking those things. But they mixed sometimes with spices and herbs and sugar and turned it into a medicine. And I'm sure it helps some people, especially vitamins or things which a few had been discovered. And if you coated them in sugary products, you're more likely to eat it. Like I went to a restaurant the other night, and I can't believe what I did. Although I'm of normal weight, don't have diabetes, at this restaurant, there was a vegetable and a shrimp and one other dish all wrapped in sugary wraps. And then they gave you this little container of syrup, and I dipped in that, and I ate it, and I felt wonderful. Then I thought about driving home and what I know about sugar and syrups, and I realized, my living God, that was sugary food, and I wonder what my blood sugar was. Maybe I was saved because I don't have diabetes, but a lot of people have beginning diabetes, borderline diabetes, maybe 90% of the people. You ate that meal, I wonder if you'd be unconscious. I bet the blood sugars went up to 500. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. And so Louis the 14th, 1748, also had a pharmaceutical worker, and but someone painted a picture of him, beautiful gowns. He was a little guy, beautiful gowns and everything. But when he smiled on that painting, it was such a beautiful painting, you may not notice it, but I pulled it up on the computer. He's got no teeth. Yeah. And you can do it yourself. So it was a march of decay around the world, just the teeth, but other diseases too. Elizabeth I had very sweet tooth. A French ambassador noticed her teeth were yellow and unequal. Okay? Sugar reaches the enamel, and the acid of that destroys the teeth. It didn't happen till we refined the sugar. And the reason we know that, when Mount Vesuvius exploded in Greece and buried all the people like that, and hundreds of years later, within even our time, they got out autopsies of the bodies, which were largely now largely frozen but preserved. We notice normal teeth. Mm-hmm. And what they were eating is food from nature, not processed food, not refined sugar. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, so they now have proof. And King Louis the 14th had no teeth by age 40. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In France, King Louis the 12th, same rotten teeth. And so when slavery was brought closer to the Caribbean, at first it went to Martinique and Guadeloupe and Haiti. Santo Domingo, it was called years ago, which is south of us, just below Cuba, south of Florida. Those beautiful natives and all those islands were all destroyed by the viruses that the ships brought along, and a lot of them worked to death. Many of them became enslaved, and the slaves were brought from Africa to be the workers, and eventually used indentured servants. When people came, they paid them just a tiny bit, but the environment was destroyed to create farms to grow sugar cane, and it was very difficult to produce it and then refine it. And eventually, they also started growing coffee, and also some of the end products of sugar cane manufacturing was saved, and it was rum and molasses. So there are byproducts besides sugar from sugar cane, which spread across the world. Let's face it, rum spread everywhere because it made you feel good. I remember going to some of these Caribbean islands years ago for a conference or something, And I noticed in one of the countries that my taxi driver was totally intoxicated. And what they found is that the natives would drink rum, and because it was cheap, it made them tolerate the work they did, but also people with other jobs started drinking it, and intoxication was common, extremely common, and may still be significant today. And so British children now have some of the same problems that the kings had. Even children, they found out that at age 13, 14, 50, British children don't like to smile. Why is that? They're missing a lot of teeth. So we need to teach the children about avoiding sugar. Sugar is a booger and a hooker, okay? And the first island off the coast of Africa they had slavery is Madeira, Madeira. It's off the northwest part of Africa, close to Europe, pretty far off coast. They had a huge slave population, and that was the original sugar that was sent back to Britain, Germany, and it was a huge amount. And then eventually the Canary Islands, which are further down the coast of Africa, also had tremendous amount of cane sugar production and slavery. And then eventually worked itself to the Caribbean with very large plantations, thousands of acres. And Cuba was a big producer of sugar. Matter of fact, when Castro took over, it was around 1950 or so, in there he confiscated big sugar plantations, over 1,000 acres. Over 1,000 acres, yeah. And the owners had beautiful homes, but he took them away because the people working there were not being treated very well, nor received a lot of money. You know, it's the way it was. And coffee was grown also, which on these plantations. So it was coffee and then rum from the sugar cane. But all that also had a great deal of environmental impact. The coffee spread across the world also, as well as tea. Americans like coffee better, the English liked tea better, and they added sugar to it. Yeah, matter of fact, they added so much sugar in England, you could put a teaspoon in there and it would stand up. And that got to be a habit among the people. And it kind of spread across the world to put a lot of sugar into your tea, your coffee. I must say myself, I've gotten perfectly used to it. I drink black coffee. I don't put cream in it. I don't put sugar in it. And it tastes just great to me. I hope you're that lucky. Because the coffee makes you feel good enough, makes me feel good. But I could imagine if you had that much sugar, you must be on a tremendous high. The amount of dopamine and serotonin secreted. Incidentally, children, their sugar bliss is different than adults. They can tolerate a lot more sugar than we adults can, and there's even a little difference between men and women. Yeah, and the average American, incidentally, man weighs 191 pounds. The average woman, 163 pounds. Mm-hmm. Would you believe that? Would you believe that? And most of it's due to sugar consumption. I'm not being judgment-free, not being critical, but that's the reason you see so many coffee shops around. I noticed in the pandemic here that that it's slowed down a little bit. I want to take a few quotes out of the book here, and let's go over them a little bit. So, warm tea gives a feeling of enhanced well-being. Then you add some sugar to it, and man, I'm in heaven. Okay. On the eve of the American War in 1776, we were using about 200,000 tons of sugar, and 90% of it came from the Caribbean, right next door to us. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. The British were quick to switch from coffee to tea in the 1700s, partly because the expense. And there was, I wanted to quote you something on page 87, and the army, Napoleon noticed that soldiers marched a lot better if they were carrying some sugar. And since the war between him and Britain, he couldn't get any sugar, so he was interested in the development of beets for sugar, and he gave scientists a lot of money to develop it, and they did. And beet almost outpaced cane sugar for a period of time. Florence Nightingale, whom you've heard of, reprinted a pamphlet by Florence Nightingale which included a prescription: coffee for 100 men, 1 pint each. Okay, and but severe wartime shortages of sugar and coffee during the Civil War forced people to resort to a range of substitutes. Plants bringing grains. In the USA, coffee and sugar were hand in hand, as tea and sugar were in Britain. So sugar has played a huge part, even in wars and soldiers. But a lot of sugar could be made from beets, but it was more expensive to make it. But it did outpace cane sugar for about 20 years. But then sugar processing got so fast, it really speeded up tremendously. It made it so much cheaper than beet sugar. And let's speak about rum a minute. Then rum makes it mark. Remember what I said? What's left over from the processing of sugar cane, it can be left over and made into rum and molasses. Okay, and so that was not nowhere near as healthy, but it could give a heck of a kick to the body, and there were especially slaves and the poor drank a lot of rum. It was real cheap, and it would make them psychologically able to take the things that were happening to them in their life. And people still do. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people have a drink because they just ain't feeling good. Believe me, it's occurred in my life, or probably everyone's life. The point is you got to limit it. At the moment, at age 39 for the 46th time, I don't drink anything, even wine, except occasionally, because I've heard even a little bit of wine, they say it's okay. It's really not healthy. Come right down to it. I read that recently. And so when they refined sugar, they boiled it, they chopped it up, and they boiled it, and then it turned into crystals, refined it, but then it had to be refined further. But the crystals could be added to your coffee, your drink, or your food. But today, food processing companies account for about 40% of the sugar being used. They stripped off the bran and the covering of the food and added sugar. Remember the meal I ate? I explained to you. Almost everything you order in a restaurant, you got to watch it. Even pieces of chicken, they'll wrap it in a sugary product. If you feel you need to avoid it, get a weight problem, get a diabetes problem, you better watch out. And So sugar factories dotted the landscape of the colonies. Steam and smoke was coming up in the sky. All the forests were gone. And we mentioned about the waste product of sugar. Impurities resulted in rum and molasses. Now, Islam, Hindus, they don't use alcohol, so they made it into perfume and medicine, okay? And but slaves enjoyed it, the rum, of course. And 1648, they said slaves and donkeys enjoyed it. Okay. And many different varieties of it was manufactured. And a lot of us drank in the Barbados and Martinique. And like I said, I visited those islands, and even today, a lot of liquor stores, a lot of people walking around not too well, consuming it, and I would say I probably fell for that myself. But I was on vacation, but I didn't realize that was a culture really of rum drinkers. And the thing was so unhealthy, really. In Barbados, they called it kill devil. 1670s, there were 100 taverns in Barbados and Bridgetown, which has a huge tourist industry. Can you imagine our young people going there even today? And if you're going to do something dangerous like go water skiing or Bermuda, I remember going to Bermuda, and they have you on a scooter if you're not used to using it and you've had a drink. And I noticed I was among the cars. It's actually dangerous, not as safe and fun as it looks. Risky behavior. Pay attention. Okay. Britain, the U.S. made a lot of money on taxing cane sugar and rum. They made a lot of money from the taxes. And you know, remember, Britain and the U.S. had a big conflict there, and that affected sales a great deal. And they noticed in the Barbados, the slaves and the poor people were, drinking a lot more, and all of a sudden they would start vomiting. Didn't seem to stop, and it was a real problem. Turned out that it was the lead in the pipes they were using to refine sugar. Yeah. Then they switched to copper stills. You still see copper stills today, and and the rum was even the master of the plantation, the man who ran it, and the slave. They all were drinking this stuff. Okay, and but with the rum, you could see that people are in a roller coaster to ride, and then the sugar plantations really took off, and they just destroyed the forest and built plantations everywhere because the whole world was consuming sugar. Then Thomas Jefferson experimented and mixed it to discover ice cream. It takes a lot of sugar to make ice cream. So if you're trying to avoid sugar, I guess you know what to avoid, but it sure does taste good. And then tobacco was grown by the slaves too. I'll tell you an interesting thing. This you would not believe, but I knew it years ago, but then recently I read it again in Gary Taub's book. He has a whole chapter to it. Cigarettes, nicotine was addicting maybe 12% of the people around 1910, which already was known from these islands. It was known. If you add some sugar to cigarette, makes you feel even better, and people can double the rate of consuming it, and of course they consume it for a while, become addicted. So they doubled the number of people with addiction by adding sugar. Even today, there's sugar in every cigarette people smoke. Yep. Read Gary Taub's book, page 39, I think it explains it, but I knew it already. I almost didn't believe it, but when I see him, yeah, the sugar industry has added the sugar to cigarettes, and the reason is that sugar opens the alveoli in your lungs and sends the nicotine into the bloodstream, and of course that's what addiction is from. Sugar in cigarettes. Remember we talked about this world scam with sugar going on? That's even a bigger one. So the British consumed more tea and rum, and they put sugar into the tea. Remember, our blood system has in it 1 teaspoonful of sugar. Mm-hmm. That's all our blood system has, but yet they were putting 3 to 4 teaspoons of sugar in a cup of tea. Mm-hmm. And maybe 2 or 3 times a day, okay? And so rum had a devastating impact on the native people in the Caribbean. And behind it all, acres of sugar can be cultivated by enslaved Africans. That was really behind it. If the slaves weren't there, if it could not be cultivated to reduce the cost, sugar would never have spread around the world. Slavery was the key. Okay, and tobacco and the island of Bahia, Bahia, they're the ones who discovered that if you soaked it in molasses, you felt even better, and the addiction rate, sugar, nicotine, went up, and you'd be a recurrent customer. So they may be the original ones who came up with it. So sugar went global, okay? 1833, Britain ended slavery, and that's a wonderful story to read about. It took a long time, but they finally got it done. It's what they stopped was the shipping of slaves. I mean, that essentially killed it. And then the Americans, by 1888, managed to stop it, okay? And Napoleon, the armies marched on their bellies. They gave them sugary products. And by 2000, 100 countries cultivated sugar. 1,800, mainly the Caribbean and Brazil. Brazil had originally had the sugar slaves. If you look at a world map, which I again did this morning, look at the whole thing, you can see that Brazil has a direct shot at the Canary Islands on the northwest side of Africa. And they brought them across, and they were the ones that were the biggest seller of sugar. They were dominating it back in the 1500s or so. And then after the slavery was generally stopped, they used indentured servants, where you owed them something and you worked at a very low wage. And so let's talk about the sweetening of America a little bit, okay? In 1914, the Americans and the British were devouring an unprecedented amount of sugar, huge amount. And North America, about 7 million pounds around 1800, then up to 82 million by 1900, okay? Europe, 203 million pounds, 408, and 729 100 years later. And the price went down. Price went down. The Civil War, there was decreased sugar refining, less available to soldiers that needed it. there was the McKinsey Act, 1890, charged tariffs on sugar, and prices fell. Okay. In 1887, a man named Habermeyer in the United States amalgamated 23 refineries and made one company out of it, the American Sugar Company, which controlled 98% of the sugar. Of course, guess what? He controlled the price. He owned all the companies. It shouldn't have been allowed, but it became political. But the price drops, so they could sell more, so the middle class now could use cakes and chocolates and jams. Jams are 60% sugar. Jams became very popular. So there was a power shift going on in the New World. Sugar entered politics, taxes. Some business people concentrate the whole thing. They had total control of it. So for 2 centuries, there was conflict. There was conflict. In Haiti, there was an Indian revolt where the slaves revolted, and that makes a story in itself. And France was involved with that, and France's source of sugar went down because of all the conflict going on in Haiti. Eventually, around 1850, in Louisiana, United States, there were 125,000 slaves, okay? And indentured servants came from Cuba and the U.S. And then the beet industry started competing with the sugar industry, but the competition stopped because of the First World War in 1914, and Britain couldn't get sugar from the beet industry. It was mainly Germany and France, and they had to go back into the world and buy sugar other places. Cuba grew a lot of sugar to the point that we invaded Cuba to keep the rights. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And remember that Castro took the plantations back and kicked the people off, anyone over 1,000 acres, which just seemed like a lot of acres. And so in 1958 was the Cuban Revolution, the Castro thing. And so U.S. lost 50% of the sugar supply. And we started planting sugar in Florida. The problem there became the Everglades, and the damage from the sugar plantation was ruining the Everglades. A lot of damage in the Everglades, and it's still. And they were using immigrant labor. They brought the labor in from Mexico and Cuba and other countries, so that was a problem too. About politics were at work, and so Florida stopped producing quite a bit of sugar, and but eventually slavery, was gone from Louisiana too. But by this time, they left behind the appetite for sweetness. So through slavery, we developed this industry of sugar. The whole world became addicted to sugar. And then slavery was gone, and the price started going up, and countries had to import sugar. But in Britain, till 1914, the war started. That was the end of that. But refining sugar now became quicker. It was a half hour, now it was 5 minutes, so that in the beginning of the 19th century, Britain had gotten 80% of the sugar from beets from Germany and Austria. But that stopped with the war. And but now people were adding sugar to the coffee or to the tea, but they were also starting to eat it. The processed food was bringing it in, and especially breakfast cereals. Dr. Kellogg, right up close to us here, southern Michigan, near Chicago, he started manufacturing breakfast cereals, which people dumped a lot of sugar. Very unhealthiest thing. If you can start the day with a good breakfast of good protein, good fats like guacamole, you'll be very healthy. But if you're starting with a cereal and you put sugar on it and a very unhealthy breakfast, you're probably going to gain weight. You're probably going to get diabetes, the wrong way to eat. Then the Kellogg's was selling it at 6 different brands. Chocolate companies also took over. Fry, Roundtree. Roundtree was selling so much they had their own rail line. Yeah, and it was on billboards everywhere. So avoid a sugary breakfast unless you want to gain some weight, because it'll shoot your insulin level up and then it'll go down and you'll be hungry again. Okay, and so the military in 1914 in the war, they used up a lot of sugar. That makes them feel good, and 40% of the sugar is used in processed foods. So all these fast food companies that went all over the world are using a great deal of this sugar. And during the war, they rationed it actually a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about weight gain. It's a judgment-free zone, okay? And so obesity matters. In 2015, the World Health Organization said there are 2 billion people overweight in the world. Then that's 2015, okay? And then it doubled again in another 15 years. It's going to double again in another 15 years, yeah. 1980, it was 2 billion. 2015, it was 4 billion. That's over half the world, okay? And nothing wrong with overweight, except odds are you're sick. If you're overweight, odds are you're diabetic. You need to have a serum insulin and a serum sugar to see if you're on the path to diabetes. I tried to take you across the world here and to see, so you understand that sugar is a plague. It has corrupted the world. It's corrupted business. It's still corrupting us today, because I've been to all the hospitals to see if I can start a program of preventing, stopping, reversing diabetes. No one's interested. They just stare at you. And then if you're overweight, odds are you're diabetic. That's gonna be some years take off your life. That's the reason I'm doing this. I'm trying to get you to know that if you need some personal coaching, look at my website. On the screen there, I see people for nothing on Fridays, and I have a lot of diabetics, even with advanced renal disease, that I've been able to help. Here's a book I want to hold up a little bit too. Just look at the name. Just look at the name. The New Slavery. We are slaves again. We are slaves again. Mm-hmm. Slaves to sugar, because it's addictive. It makes me feel good. What's a little bit disturbing too is that people go to some meeting, especially churches, and they hand you all these sugary products. The whole plate of sugary foods should not be done. Don't eat them. They shouldn't do that. They should take your health. This is your God's body, your body. If you're religious, it could be the body that God gave you, and you don't want to be feeding it sugar and become unhealthy. You want to eat a healthy way. Let me just read you one quick thing here. one chapter out of my book called Sugar. Sugar is our cocaine. It makes us feel good. We're hardwired for sweets through evolution, through time, because so you would stay alive. It's been arranged by God, evolution, whatever, for us to seek sugar to stay alive. Look at my other YouTube shows. I'll do run another program on this because I have a lot more information on this. But once you learn to eat differently, good fats, 20% protein, maybe 15% fruit, vegetables, yes. It's good fats you want to know about. Have that for breakfast, and you'll live to be 100 and play pickleball with me. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye. See you.